Mysteries await just a page away. Ready to dive in? Welcome to The Book Reader, where stories unfold one enchanting page at a time. Subscribe now and unlock the magic.
Night Without End by Alistair MacLean. Night Without End.
Chapter 2, Monday 1 a.m., 2 a.m. My greatest fear had already proved groundless. There was no sign of fire anywhere, no flickering red to see, no hidden crackling to hear. It was still possible that some small tongue of flame was creeping along inside the fuselage or wings looking for the petrol or oil that would help it blaze into destructive life. And with that wind to fan the flames, destruction would have been complete. It hardly seemed worth worrying about. And it was unlikely that any pilot cool-headed enough to turn off the ignition would have forgotten to shut down the petrol lines. Already Jack Straw had plugged our searchlight into the dry battery and handed me the lamp. I pressed the switch, and it worked. A narrow but powerful beam good for 600 yards in normal conditions. I swung the beam to my right, then brought it slowly forward. Whatever colors the plane may have had originally, it was impossible to distinguish any of them now. The entire fuselage was already shrouded in a sheet of thin rimed ice, dazzling to the eye, reflecting the light with the intensity almost of a chromed mirror. The tail unit was intact. So, too, was the fuselage for half its length, then crumpled and torn underneath, directly opposite the spot where we stood. The left wing was tilted upwards at an angle of about 5 degrees above the normal. The plane wasn't on such an even keel as I had first thought. From where I stood, this wing blocked off my view of the front, but just above and beyond it, I saw something that made me temporarily forget the urgency of my concern for those inside and stand there, stock still, the beam trained unwaveringly on that spot. Even under the coating of ice, the big, bold lettering BOAC was clearly visible. BOAC. What on earth was a BOAC airliner doing in this part of the world? The SAS and KLM, I knew, operated transarctic flights from Copenhagen and Amsterdam to Winnipeg, Los Angeles, and Vancouver via Sander-Stromfjord, about an hour and a half flying time away to the southwest on. The west coast of Greenland, just on the Arctic Circle, and I was pretty sure that Pan American and Trans World operated reciprocal services on the same route. It was just barely possible that freak weather conditions had forced one of these planes far enough off course to account for its presence here. But if I was right about the BOAC, it just wasn't possible. I found the door, Dr. Mason. Jack Straw had taken my arm, jerking me out of my reverie, and was pointing to a big oval door with its lowest point just at our eye level. We will try these, perhaps? I heard the metallic clang as he lifted a couple of crowbars off the sledge and nodded. We could only try. I set the searchlight on the snow, adjusted it on its gimbals so as to illuminate the door, took one of the crowbars and thrust it beneath the foot of the oval, the flattened end sliding easily between door and fuselage. Jack Straw did the same. We heaved together, but nothing happened. Again we heaved, and again, our feet coming clear of the ground, but the door remained immovable. To localize pressure, we concentrated on one bar, and this time we felt something giving, but it was the lever, not the door. With a pistol-shot crack, the cold-weakened crowbar snapped 6 inches from the end, and we both landed on our backs. Even the urgency of the moment, my almost complete lack of knowledge about planes, was no excuse. I cursed my stupidity in wasting valuable time trying to force open a massive door locked on the inside by heavy clips designed to withstand an internal pressure of many thousands of pounds, grabbed searchlight and battery, ducked round under the towering tail. Assembly into the full force of the wind and flying drift, and move forward till I came to the right wing. Its tip was buried deep under the frozen snow, the air screw blades bent back at right angles to their normal line. I thought perhaps I might try to scramble up the wing towards the fuselage and smash in one of the cabin windows, but after a couple of seconds wild slithering on the ice-sheeted wing in that gusting gale wind, I gave up the idea. To maintain a foothold was quite impossible. Besides, it was doubtful whether I could have smashed in a window anyway. Like the door, the windows were designed to withstand great pressures. Stumbling, slipping, we ran round the buried tip of the wing, and clear in sight now was the ice hummock that had brought the big airliner to its sudden halt. About 15 feet high and 20 wide at the base, it lay in the right angle formed by the front of the fuselage and the leading edge of the wing. But it wasn't the root of the wing that had absorbed the initial impact. A glance at the nose of the aircraft was enough to show that. The plane must have crashed into the ice mound just to right of center of the control cabin. The windscreens were smashed, the fuselage ripped open and crushed back for 6 or 7 feet. What had happened to the pilot sitting on that side at the moment of the telescopic impact just didn't bear thinking about. But at least we had found our way in. I set the searchlight so that its beam illuminated the wrecked control cabin, gauged the distance to the lower sill of the windscreen. It must have been fully 9 feet, and jumped. My gloved hands hooked on firmly, but slipped almost at once on the ice-rimed surface. I grabbed for a purchase grip on one of the windscreen pillars, felt my fingers striking against solid glass on both sides. The windscreen hadn't been as completely shattered as I had imagined, and was on the point of losing my hold altogether when Jack Straw moved forward swiftly and took my weight. With my knees on his shoulders and a fire axe in my hand, it took me no more than 2 minutes to smash away the glass that clung to the pillars and the upper and lower edges. I hadn't realized that aircraft glass toughened perspex could be so tough, nor, when it came to clambering through into the control cabin in my bulky furs, that windscreens could be so narrow. I landed on top of a dead man. Even in the darkness, I knew he was dead. I fumbled under my parka, brought out the torch, switched it on for a couple of seconds, then put it out. It was the co-pilot, the man who had taken the full impact of the crash. He was pinned, crushed between his seat and the twisted, fractured wreckage of what had been control columns, levers, and dashboard instruments. Not since I had once been called out to the scene of a head-on collision between a racing motorcyclist and a heavy truck had I seen such dreadful injuries on any man. Whatever any of the survivors, the shocked and injured survivors in the plane, must see, it mustn't be this. It was ghastly beyond description. I turned and leaned out the windscreen. Jack Straw was directly below, cupped gloved hands shielding his eyes against the flying ice spicules as he stared upwards. "Bring a blanket," I shouted. "Better, bring a full gunny sack. And the morphia kit. Then come up yourself." He was back in 20 seconds. I caught both sack and morphia box, placed them on the twisted cabin floor behind me, then reached out a hand to help Jack Straw, but it wasn't necessary. Athleticism wasn't the forte of the short, arid, stocky Greenlanders, but Jackstraw was the fittest and most agile man I had ever met. He sprang, caught the lower sill of the left windscreen in his left hand, the central pillar in the other, and swung legs and body through the center screen, as if he had been doing this sort of thing all his life. I gave him my torch to hold, rummaged in the gunny's sack, and dragged out a blanket. I spread it over the dead co-pilot, tucking the corners down among twisted and broken ends of metal so that it shouldn't blow free in the icy wind that swirled and gusted through the wrecked control cabin. Waste of a good blanket, I suppose, I muttered. But, well, it isn't pretty. It isn't pretty, Jackstraw agreed. His voice was quite steady, devoid of all inflection. How about this one? I looked across at the left-hand side of the cabin. It was almost completely undamaged, and the chief pilot, still strapped in his seat and slumped against the side screens, seemed quite unmarked. I stripped fur glove, mitten, and silk glove off my right hand, reached out and touched the forehead. We had been out of doors now for over 15 minutes in that ferocious cold, and I would have sworn that my hand was about as cold as the human flesh could get. But I was wrong. I pulled the gloves back on and turned away, without touching him further. I wasn't carrying out any autopsies that night. A few feet farther back, we found the radio operator in his compartment. He was half sitting, half lying against the for'ard bulkhead of a shackware. He must have been catapulted by the crash. His right hand was still clutched firmly round the hand grip of the front panel of his radio set. It must have been ripped clear off the transmitter, which didn't look as if it would ever transmit anything again. On the bulkhead, behind his head, blood gleamed dully in the torchlight. I bent over the unconscious man, minus one could see that he was still breathing, removed my gloves once more, and gently slid my fingers behind his head. Just as gently I withdrew them. How the hell, I thought, part hopelessly, part savagely, am I to carry out a head operation on a person with a telescoped occiput, the state he was in? I wouldn't have given a fig for his chance in the finest operating theater in London. At the very least, he would be blind for life. The sight center must have been completely destroyed. I reached for his pulse, racing, faint, erratic to a degree. The thought came to me, a thought compounded as much of cowardice as of regret, that in all likelihood the possibility of my having to operate on him was remote, very remote. If he were to survive the inevitably rough handling that would be needed to get him out of that aircraft, and then the journey back to the cabin through that ice-laden sub-zero gale, it would be a miracle indeed. It seemed unlikely that he would ever wake again, but he just conceivably might, so I broached the morphia kit. Then we eased his head and neck into a more comfortable position, covered him with a blanket, and left him. Immediately behind a radio compartment was a long, narrow room which extended across 2/3 of the width of the plane. A quick glance at the 2 chairs and collapsible bunk was enough to show that this must be the crew's restroom, and someone had been resting there at the moment of the crash. That crumpled, shirt-sleeved figure on the floor must have been taken completely unawares before he had the slightest knowledge of what was happening, and he would never know now. We found the stewardess in the pantry, lying on her left side on the floor, the outspread black hair fallen forward over her face. She was moaning softly to herself, but it wasn't the moan of one in pain. Her pulse was steady enough, but fast. Jack Straw stooped down beside me. "Shall we lift her, Dr. Mason?" "No." I shook my head. "She's coming to, I think, and she can tell us far quicker than we can find out whether there's anything broken. Another blanket, and we'll let her be. Almost certainly someone much more in need of our attention." The door leading into the main passenger compartment was locked. At least it appeared to be, but I was pretty certain it would never be locked under normal circumstances. Perhaps it had been warped by the impact of landing. It was no time for half measures. Together we took a step back, then flung all the weight of our shoulders against it. It gave suddenly 3 or 4 inches, and at the same time we heard a sharp exclamation of pain from the other side. "Careful," I warned, but Jack Straw had already eased his weight. I raised my voice. "Get back from that door, will you? We want to come in." We heard a meaningless mutter from the other side, followed by a low groan and the slipping shuffle of someone trying to haul himself to his feet. Then the door opened, and we passed quickly inside. The blast of hot air struck me in the face like an almost physical bio. I gasped, fought off a passing moment of weakness when my legs threatened to give under me, then recovered sufficiently to bang the door shut behind me. With the motors dead and the Arctic chill striking through the thin steel of the fuselage, this warmth, no matter how efficient the cabin insulation, wouldn't last long. But while it did, it might be the saving of all those who still lived. A thought struck me, and ignoring the man who stood swaying before me, one hand clutching a seat grip for support, the other rubbing at a blood-masked forehead, I turned to Jack Straw. "Carry the stewardess in here. We'll take a chance, and it's not all that much of a chance either. There's a damned sight more hope for her in here with a broken leg than out there, with only a bump on the head. Throw her blanket over the wireless operator, but whatever you do, don't touch him." Jack Straw nodded and went out, closing the door quickly behind him. I turned to the man who still stood shakily in the aisle, still dazedly rubbing his hand, a big brown square hand matted on the back with black hair, across a bleeding forehead. He looked at me for a moment, then stared down uncomprehendingly at the blood dripping onto the bright red tie and blue shirt that contrasted so oddly with the light gray gabardine suit. He closed his eyes tightly, then shook his head to clear it. "Sorry to ask the inevitable question." The voice was quiet, deep, well under control. "But what happened?" "You crashed," I said shortly. "What do you remember?" "Nothing." "Well, that is, just a bump, then a loud screeching, tearing noise dash." "Then you hit the door." I gestured at the bloodstains behind me. "Sit down for a moment. You'll be all right." I'd lost interest in him and was staring down the length of the cabin. I'd expected to see most of the seats wrenched off their bases, but instead they were all there exactly as they should have been, 3 wide to the left of me, 2 to the right, the seats in the front half facing aft, those to the rear facing forward. More than that, I had expected to see people, injured, broken, and moaning people flung all over the seats and aisles, but the big passenger compartment seemed almost empty, and there wasn't a sound to be heard. But it wasn't empty, not quite. Apart from the man by my side, there were, I found, 9 others altogether. 2 men lay in the front part of the aisle. One, a big, broad-shouldered man with curly dark hair, was propped up on an elbow, staring around him with a puzzled frown on his face. Near him, lying on his side, was a smaller, much older man, but all I could see of him were a few wisps of black hair plastered across a bald head, a Glenurquhart plaid jacket that seemed a couple of sizes too big for him, and the loudest check tie it had ever been my misfortune to see. It seemed obvious that they had been sitting together in the left-hand seat adjacent to them and had been flung out when the plane crashed into the ice mound and slewed violently to one side. In the seat beyond that, also on the left, a man sat by himself. My first reaction was surprise that he, too, hadn't been hurled into the aisle, but then I saw that he was awake and fully conscious. He was sitting rigidly in his seat, pressed in hard against the window, legs braced on the floor, holding on with both hands to the table fixed to the seat in front. Taut tendons ridged the backs of his thin white hands, and his knuckles gleamed in the torchlight. I lifted the beam higher, saw that he was wearing a close-fitting clerical collar. "Relax, Reverend," I said soothingly. "Terra firma once more, and this is as far as you are going." He said nothing, just stared at me through rimless glasses, so I left him. He seemed unhurt. For people sat in the right-hand side of the front part of the plane, each one in a window seat, 2 women, 2 men. One of the women was fairly elderly, but so heavily made up and with her hair so expensively dyed and marcelled that I couldn't have guessed her age within 10 years. Her face, somehow, seemed vaguely familiar. She was awake and looking slowly about her, her eyes empty of understanding. So, too, was the woman in the next seat, an even more expensive-looking creature with a mink coat flung cape-wise over her shoulders to show a simple green jersey dress that I suspected cost a small fortune. She was about 25, I guess, and with her blonde hair, gray eyes, and perfect features, would have been one of the most beautiful women I had ever seen, if it weren't for the overfull and rather sulky mouth. Maybe, I thought uncharitably, she remembered to do something about that mouth when she was fully awake. But right then, she wasn't fully awake. None of them was. They all behaved as if they were being dragged up from the depths of an exhausting sleep. Still more asleep than awake were the other 2 men in the front, one a big, burly, high-colored man of about 55, with the gleaming thick white hair and mustache of the caricature of a Dixie colonel. The other was a thin, elderly man, his face heavily lined, unmistakably Jewish. Not bad going so far, I thought with relief. 8 people, and only one cut forehead among the lot of them. The perfect argument, if ever there was one, for having all seats in a plane face towards the rear. No question but that they all owed, if not their lives, at least their immunity to injury to the fact that their high-backed seats had almost completely cushioned and absorbed the shock of impact. The 2 passengers in the rear end of the cabin were the perfect argument for not having the seat face forward. The first I came to, a brown-haired young girl of about 18 or 19, wearing a belted raincoat, was lying on the floor between 2 seats. She was stirring, and as I put my hands under her arms to help her up, she screamed in sudden pain. I changed my grip and lifted her gently onto the seat. My shoulder. Her voice was low and husky. "It is very sore." I'm not surprised. I'd eased back the blouse at the neck and closed it again. "Your clavicle, the collarbone, is gone. Just sit there and hold your left arm in your right hand. Yes, so. I'll strap you up later. You won't feel a thing, I promise you." She smiled at me, Half timidly, half gratefully, and said nothing, I left her, went to the very rear seat in the plane, stooped to examine the man there, then straightened in almost the same instant. The weirdly unnatural angle of the head on the shoulders made any examination superfluous. I turned and walked forward. Everybody was awake now, sitting upright or struggling dazedly to their feet, their half-formed questions as dazed as the expressions on their faces. I ignored them for a moment, looked questioningly at Jackstraw as he came through the forward door, closely followed by Joss. She won't come. Jackstraw jerked his thumb over his shoulder. She's awake, but she won't leave the wireless operator. She's all right. Her back hurts, I think. She wouldn't say. I made no answer and moved across to the main door, the one we'd failed to open from the outside. I supposed it no business of mine if the stewardess chose to devote her attention to a member of the crew instead of to the passengers who were her charges. But it was damned queer all the same, almost as queer as the fact that though the inevitability of the crash must have been known for at least 15 minutes before the actual event, not one of the 10 passengers in the cabin had been wearing a seatbelt, and the stewardess, wireless operator, and the crew member in the restroom appeared to have been caught completely unprepared. The circular door handle refused to budge. I called Jackstraw, but even the extra weight made not the slightest impression on it. Obviously, it was immovably jammed. There must have been a slight telescoping effect along the entire length of the fuselage as the plane had crashed into the ice mound. If the door I had noticed behind the control cabin was as badly warped as this one, and being nearer the point of impact, it almost inevitably would be. Fenthied, all have to leave via the windscreens of the control cabin. I thought of the wireless operator with his dreadful head wound and wondered bleakly whether even trying to move him out could be more than a futile gesture anyway. A figure barred my way as I turned from the door. It was the white-haired, white-mustached Dixie Colonel. His face was dark red, his eyes light blue, choleric and protuberant. It only required someone to get this man good and mad, and he would be no more than a debit entry in the account book of some life assurance company. And he seemed good and mad now. What's happened? What in the devil is all this? He had a voice like a Dixie Colonel, too. The Mason-Dixon line lay far to the north of wherever he had been born. We've landed. Why? What we doing here? What's the noise outside? And who in the name of heaven are you? A big business tycoon, I thought, Riley with money enough and power enough to indulge an obviously over-generous capacity for righteous indignation. If I was going to meet any trouble, it wasn't hard to guess the direction it was going to come from. But right then, there was some excuse for his attitude. I wondered how I would have felt if I had gone to sleep in a transatlantic airliner and woken up to find myself landed in the freezing middle of nowhere with 3 fur-clad people, complete with snow goggles and snow masks, waddling about the aisle of the plane. "You've crash-landed," I said briefly. "I don't know why. How the hell should I? The noise outside is an ice blizzard rattling against the fuselage. As for us, we are scientists managing an international geophysical year station half a mile from here. We saw and heard you just before you crashed." I made to push past him, but he barred my way. "Just a minute, if you don't mind." The voice was more authoritative than ever, and there was a surprising amount of muscle, in that arm across my chest. I think we have a right to know Dash. Later, I knocked his arm away, and Jackstraw completed the job by pushing him down into his seat. Don't make a damn nuisance of yourself. There's a critically injured man who has to have attention, and at once. We'll take him to safety and then come back for you. Keep the door shut. I was addressing all of them now, but the white-haired man's wrathful spluttering attracted my attention again. And if you don't shut up and cooperate, you can stay here. If it weren't for us, you'd be dead, stiff as a board, in a couple of hours. Maybe you will be yet. I moved up the aisle, followed by Jackstraw. The young man who had been lying on the floor pulled himself onto a seat, and he grinned at me as I passed. How to win friends and influence people. He had a slow, cultured drawl. I fear you have offended our worthy friend. I fear I have. I smiled, passed by, then turned. These wide shoulders and large, capable hands could be more than useful to us. How are you feeling? Recovering rapidly. You are indeed. You didn't look so good a minute ago. Just taking a long count, he said easily. Can I help? That's why I asked. I nodded. Glad to oblige. He heaved himself to his feet, towering inches above me. The little man in the loud tie and the Glenurquhart jacket gave an anguished sound like the yelp of an injured puppy. Careful, Johnny, careful. The voice, the rich, nasal, and rather grating twang, was pure Bowery. We got our responsibilities, boy, big commitments. We might strain a ligament, Dash. Relax, Solly. The big man patted him soothingly on his bald head. Just taking a little walk to clear my head. Not till you put this parka and pants on first. I'd no time to bother about the eccentricities of little men in loud jackets and louder ties. You'll need them. Cold doesn't bother me, friend. This cold will. Outside that door, it's 110 degrees below the temperature of this cabin. I heard a murmur of astonishment from some of the passengers, and the large young man, suddenly thoughtful, took the clothes from Jackstraw. I didn't wait until he had put them on, but went out with Joss. The stewardess was bent low over the injured wireless operator. I pulled her gently to her feet. She offered no resistance, just looked wordlessly at me, the deep brown eyes huge in a face dead white and strained with shock. She was shivering violently. Her hands were like ice. You want to die of cold, miss? This was no time for soft and sympathetic words, and I knew these girls were trained how to behave in emergencies. Haven't you got a hat, coat, boots, anything like that? Yes. Her voice was dull, almost devoid of life. She was standing alone by the door now, and I could hear the violent rat-a-tat of her elbow as it shook uncontrollably and knocked against the door. To go and get them. Joss scrambled out through the windscreen to get the collapsible stretcher. While we were waiting, I went to the exit door behind the flight deck and tried to open it, swinging at it with the back of my fire axe. But it was locked solid. We had the stretcher up and were lashing the wireless operator inside as carefully as we could in these cramped conditions when the stewardess reappeared. She was wearing her uniform-heavy coat now and high boots. I tossed her a pair of caribou trousers. Better, but not enough. Put these on. She hesitated, and I added roughly, we won't look. I -1 must go and see the passengers. They're all right. Bit late in thinking about it, aren't you? I know. I'm sorry. I couldn't leave him. She looked down at the young man at her feet. Dash, she broke off, then it came out with a rush. Is he going to die? Probably, I said, and she flinched away as if I had struck her across the face. I hadn't meant to be brutal, just clinical. We'll do what we can for him. It's not much, I'm afraid. Finally, we had him securely lashed to the stretcher, his head cushioned against the shock, as best we could. When I got to my feet, the stewardess was just pulling her coat down over the caribou pants. We're taking him back to our cabin, I said. We have a sledge below. There's room for another. You could protect his head. Want to come? The passengers dash, she began uncertainly. They'll be all right. I went back inside the main cabin, closing the door behind me, and handed my torch to the man with the cut brow. The 2 feeble night or emergency lights that burned inside were poor enough for illumination, worse still for morale. We're taking the wireless operator and stewardess with us, I explained, back in 20 minutes. And if you want to live, just keep this door tight shut. What an extraordinarily brusque young man, the elderly lady murmured. Her voice was low-pitched, resonant, with an extraordinary carrying power. Only from necessity, madam, I said dryly. Would you really prefer long-winded and flowery speeches, the while you were freezing to death? Well, do you know, I really don't think I would, she answered mock seriously, and I could hear her chuckling, there was no other word for it, as I closed the door behind me. Working in the cramped confines of that wrecked control cabin, in almost pitch darkness, and with that ice-laden bitter gale whistling through the shattered windscreens, we had the devil's own time of it trying to get the injured wireless operator down to that waiting sledge below. Without the help of the big young stranger, I don't think we would ever have managed it, but manage it we eventually did. He and I lowered and slid the stretcher down to Jackstraw and Joss, who took and strapped it on the sledge. Then we eased the stewardess down. I thought I heard her cry out as she hung supported only by a hand round either wrist, and remembered that Jackstraw had said something about her back being injured. But there was no time for such things now. I jumped down, and a couple of seconds later the big young man joined me. I hadn't intended that he should come, but there was no harm in it. He had to go sometime, and there was no question of his having to ride on the sledge. The wind had eased a little, perhaps, but the cold was crueler than ever. Even the dogs cowered miserably in the lee of the plain. Now and again one of them stretched out a neck in protest and gave its long, mournful wolf call, a sound eerie beyond description. But their misery was all to the good. As Jackstraw said, they were mad to run. And with the wind and ice drift behind them, run they did. At first I led the way with the torch, but Balto, the big lead dog, brushed me aside and raced on into the darkness. I had sense enough to let him have his head. He followed the twisting route of the plains snow furrow, the bamboos, homing spool and antenna line as swiftly and unerringly as if it had been broad daylight, and the polished steel runners of the sledge fairly hissed across the snow. The frozen ground was smooth and flat as river ice. No ambulance could have carried the wireless operator as comfortably as our sledge did that night. It took us no more than 5 minutes to reach the cabin, and in 3 more minutes we were on our way again. They were a busy 3 minutes. Jackstraw lit the oil stove, oil lamp, and Coleman pressure lamp, while Joss and I put the injured man on a collapsible cot before the stove, worked him into my sleeping bag, slid in half a dozen heat pads, waterproof pads containing a chemical which gave off heat when water was added, placed a rolled-up blanket under his neck to keep the back of his head off the cot, and zipped the sleeping bag shut. I had surgical instruments enough to do what had to be done, but it had to wait. Not so much because we had others still to rescue, urgent enough though that was, but the man lying at our feet, so still, so ashen-faced, was suffering so severely from shock and exposure that to touch him would have been to kill him. I was astonished that he had managed to survive even this long. I told the stewardess to make some coffee, gave her the necessary instructions, and then we left her and the big young man together. The girl heating a pan over a pile of metatablets, the young man staring incredulously into a mirror as he kneaded a frostbitten cheek and chin with one hand, and with another held a cold compress to a frozen ear. We took with us the warm clothes we had lent them, some rolls of bandages, and left. 10 minutes later, we were back inside the plane. Despite its insulation, the temperature inside the main cabin had already dropped at least 30 degrees, and almost everyone was shivering with the cold, one or two beating their arms to keep themselves warm. Even the Dixie Colonel was looking very subdued. The elderly lady, fur coat tightly wrapped around her, looked to her watch and smiled. 20 minutes exactly. You are very prompt, young man. We try to be of service. I dumped the pile of clothes I was carrying on a seat, nodded at them, and the contents of a gunny sack Joss and Jackstraw were emptying. Share these out between you and be as quick as you can. I want you to get out at once. My two friends here will take you back. Perhaps one of you will be kind enough to remain behind. I looked to where the young girl still sat alone in her back seat, still holding her left forearm in her hand. "'Till need some help to fix this young lady up." Fix her up? It was the expensive young woman in the expensive fur speaking for the first time. Her voice was expensive as the rest of her and made me want to reach for a hairbrush. Why? What on earth is the matef with her? "Her collarbone is broken," I said shortly. "Collarbone broken?" The elderly lady was on her feet, her face a nice mixture of concern and indignation. "And she's been sitting there alone all this time. Why didn't you tell us, you silly man?" "I forgot," I replied mildly. "Besides, what good would it have done?" I looked down at the girl in the mink coat. Goodness only knew that I didn't particularly want her, but the injured girl had struck me as being almost painfully shy, and I was sure she'd prefer to have one of her own sex around. "Would you like to give me a hand?" She stared at me, a cold, surprised stare that would have been normal enough had I made some outrageous or improper request, but before she could answer, the elderly lady broke in again. "'Till stay behind. I'd love to help." "Well, dash," I began doubtfully, but she interrupted immediately. "Well, yourself. What's the matter? Think I'm too old, hey?" No, of course not," I protested. "A fluent liar, but a gallant one." She grinned. "Come on. We're wasting this valuable time you're always so concerned about." We brought the girl into the first of the rear seats, where there was plenty of space between that and the first of the rearward-facing front seats, and had just worked her coat off when Joss called me. We're off now. Sir back in 20 minutes. As the door closed behind the last of them, and I broke open a roll of bandage, the old lady looked quizzically at me. Know what you're doing, young man? More or less. I'm a doctor. Doctor, hey? She looked at me with open suspicion, and what with my bulky, oil-streaked, and smelly furs, not to mention the fact that I hadn't shaved for 3 days, I suppose there was justification enough for it. You sure? Sure, I'm sure, I said irritably. What do you expect me to do? Whip my medical degree out from under this parka, or just wear round my neck a brass plate, giving my consulting hours? We'll get along, young man, she chuckled. She patted my arm, then turned to the young girl. What's your name, my dear? Helene. We could hardly catch it. The voice was so low. Her embarrassment was positively painful. Helene, a lovely name. And indeed, the way she said it made it sound so. You're not British, are you? Or American? I'm from Germany, madam. Don't call me madam. You know, you speak English beautifully. Germany, hey? Bavaria for a guess? Yes. The rather plain face was transfigured in a smile, and I mentally saluted the old lady for the ease with which she was distracting the young girl's thoughts from the pain. Munich. Perhaps you know it. Like the back of my hand, she said complacently. And not just the Hofbrauhaus either. You're still very young, aren't you? I'm 17. 17. A nostalgic sigh. My dear, I remember when I was 17. A different world. There was no transatlantic airliner in those days, I can tell you. In fact, I murmured, the Wright brothers were hardly airborne. The face had been more than familiar to me, and I was annoyed that I should have taken so long in placing it. I suppose it was because her normal setting was so utterly different from this bleak and frozen world. Being insulting, young man, she queried, but there was no offense in her face. I can't imagine anyone ever insulting you. The world was at your feet, even in the Edwardian days, Miss Lugard. You know me then? She seemed genuinely pleased. It would be difficult to find anyone who doesn't know the name of Marie Lugard. I nodded at the young girl. See, Helene knows it too. And it was clear from the awestruck expression on the young German girl's face that the name meant as much to her as to me. 20 years Queen of the Music Hall, 30 years Queen of the Musical Comedy Stage, beloved wherever she was known less for her genius than for the innate kindliness and goodness which she tried to conceal from the world with a waspish tongue, for the half-dozen orphanages she maintained in Britain and Europe, Marie Lugard was one of the few truly international names in the world of entertainment. Yes, I see you know my name. Marie Lugard smiled at me. But how did you know me? From your photograph, naturally. I saw it in Life the other week. Miss Lugard. Marie, to my friends. I don't know you, I protested. I paid a small fortune to have that photograph retouched and made briefly presentable, she answered obliquely. It was a splendid photograph, inasmuch as it bore precious little resemblance to the face that I carry about with me. Anyone who recognizes me from that is my friend for life. Besides, she smiled, I bear nothing but the most amicable feelings towards people who save my life. I said nothing, just concentrated on finishing the job of strapping up Helene's arm and shoulders as quickly as possible. She was blue with cold and shivering uncontrollably. but she hadn't uttered a murmur throughout, and smiled gratefully at me when I was finished. Marie Lugard regarded my handiwork approvingly. "I really do believe you have picked up some smattering of your trade along the way, Dr. Dash Mason. Peter Mason, Peter to my friends. Peter it shall be. Come on, Helene, into your clothes as fast as you like." 15 minutes later, we were back in the cabin. Jack Straw went to unharness the dogs and secure them to the tethering cable, while Joss and I helped the two women down the ice-coated steps from the trapdoor. But I had no sooner reached the foot of the steps than I had forgotten all about Marie Lugard and Helene, and was staring unbelievingly at the tableau before me. I was just vaguely aware of Joss by my shoulder and anger and dismay on his face, slowly giving way to a kind of reluctant horror. For what we saw, though it concerned us all, concerned him most of all. The injured wireless operator still lay where we had left him. All the others were there too, grouped in a rough semicircle round him and round a cleared space to the left of the stove. By their feet in the center of the space, upside down, and with one corner completely stove in on the wooden floor, lay the big metal RCA radio transmitter and receiver, our sole source of contact with, our only means of summoning help from the outer world. I knew next to nothing about radios, but it was chillingly obvious to me, as it was, I could see to the semicircle of fascinated onlookers that the RCA was smashed beyond recovery.
And that marks the end of the current chapter. Thank you for listening to The Book Reader. Stay tuned for the next episode tomorrow. Please subscribe for updates.